During COVID, a group of mostly Chinese researchers published an article in a medical journal called BMJ Global Health, arguing that we should open the archives of Unit 731 to learn about COVID-19, about the virus, and to potentially develop treatments and vaccination against the virus. What is Unit 731? What did they do? And can we really learn anything from them? And should we learn anything from them? That will be the focus of our conversation. To think about those questions, to ponder those questions, a group of students and myself and another faculty member from the University of Hong Kong went on a trip to Harbin, China in June of 2024 as part of a experiential learning trip to learn more about Unit 731, to learn more about the research that took place during World War II by Japanese researchers, and to learn about research ethics. Marjovi is one of the students who participated in the trip. Hi, Marjovi.
Hi, Zohar.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. How was the trip?
So, it was really fun. Apart from like the darker things, obviously. So, we went beginning of June. It was quite chilly in Harbin, but we went to the museum and then we saw a lot of exhibits that showed us like what kind of experiments took place in Harbin in World War II, as well as the victims and things that they went through, as well as the different researchers that were involved, and also the different sites that these experiments took place. We also saw some of the sites. So there was the Anda site, and there's a Beiyinhe, which is like the railway station in which the victims were transported into Harbin for these experiments. We also talked to some of the locals there to ask if they have an understanding of the experiments that took place, or like what they do know, what they've learned. And it was very eye-opening. And this trip just culminated in a mock trial that was supposed to sort of discuss the actions of the Japanese researchers and everyone who was involved. And overall, I think it was a very good learning experience, and a lot of us actually met a lot of friends, and then we also got to explore a culture, like the local culture there, and we learned so much about the history, the really dark history of Harbin, and the research ethics that were involved. Yeah.
Thank you. So this course indeed aims at learning you guys about Unit 71, about research ethics, and to share some of our experiences from that trip. This video is an introduction to the course itself. So what I was thinking, Marjovi, is maybe we talk a little bit about the experiments done by Unit 71, give them a synopsis, and also talk about the trip itself into a bit more detail. So first, let me just say how the course is going to look like. It's going to be a combination of different methods and different kinds of presentations, just because we want to make this enjoyable and we want to make this effective. All right. So part of the course will look like or is going to be presented in a form of videos, conversations, just as this one. And part of it is going to be short clips of us just lecturing about Unit 71, about research ethics, about famous or infamous cases in the history of research ethics. And maybe some will include interviews with bioethicists or experts in research ethics, and people who know a bit more about Unit 71 and about the history of Japan during that period. All right, so let's just give it a go. So, Borjovi, can you tell us a bit more about Unit 71, how it came about, what did they do, etc.?
Okay, so Unit 731 is a covert biological weaponry research program that took place in the early 20th century. So that was like around World War II. And this was led by the Imperial Japanese Army. It had like special funding from the Japanese government at the time. It was led by General Shiro Ishii, who was a scientist. He was a doctor. He went to medical school in Kyoto Imperial University. And he went around the world scouting about, learning about different biological weaponry. And then his ultimate aim was to bring it back to Japan so then he can develop like research programs and experimenting on humans. So more specifically, it would just be the Chinese in Harbin. So at the time it was called Manchukuo, which is the puppet state of Manchuria under the Japanese army. There were also some prisoners of war who were involved in the experimentations. So there are a lot of different types of experimentation that took place. You want to go into a bit more detail about that?
Yeah, sure. So we can classify the kinds of experiments into several kinds. One just involved kind of like lab setting. So, you know, individual subjects who they dissected, for instance, to learn about first of all, to learn about the anatomy in general, but to learn about the effects of the pathogens.
So that would just be actual live vivisection. So these subjects were alive and they would just like slaughter them. Yeah.
Right. So we have horrifying testimonies of Japanese researchers saying how so I remember Ioana Kess, for instance, a Japanese surgeon who talks exactly how he dissected subjects, Chinese citizens who were still alive and they were screaming of pain. He dissected them and he said, you had no choice because you lost faith if you didn't do it, right? Johanna Ken, that's his name. So that was one kind of experience, so just focusing on one individual. So that included vivisection, that included testing or seeing what happens in extreme environments, like freezing, for instance, like environments with low oxygen levels, so mimicking high atmospheric, so seeing what might happen to pilots, right? So that was one kind of experiments. We can think about that as lab kind of research. But then there were field trials, right? And that included getting subjects and putting them out in the field and throwing some pathogen on them and see what happens. So one of the most famous examples, or the example that I always have in mind, is what happened in the Anda site, which we actually went to see in the trip. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think when we went, it was a huge grass field. So there were some like cement, was it like the panels? And then it showed us like what the different patches of grass used to be. So we had like the staff canteens, the staff dormitories. There are like sites where they were actually being experimented on. And I think at the time there were also warnings that there might still be anthrax in the fields. It was very terrifying. And we also saw actually some herders, like they had their cows out. They're just like munching on the grass there. And like people just sort of treat that like something that used to be a site of some horrific experiments, and they just pretend it's just like a regular field, which was quite jarring to me actually. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Anda and other sites were really sites for field trials, where Anda, for instance, what they did was they attached the subjects to stakes in the ground and dropped bombs on them. So there were ceramic bombs with pathogens, right? In this case, it was fleas that had the Yersinia bacteria, right? So causing the bacterium that causes plague. So they dropped these ceramic bombs on these subjects and saw what happened to them. Assuming that they didn't die from the bombing itself, how Yersinia, the plague affected them. So that was the second kind of what the Japanese did. The third kind was actually engaging in assault on villages, civilian villages in Manchuria. So what they did was, for instance, infect water sources with the various pathogens like cholera, for instance. And in fact, we have testimonies of entire villages being wiped out because of these field trials.
Yeah, very horrific experiments took place. So, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, so what we did in the trip itself to Harbin, as was mentioned, we went to the museum to see, first in Harbin, to see the history of Unit 71, to see what they did. And actually that museum used to be the headquarters, the main headquarters of the unit, right? We also went to other sites. So like Bein He, that's how you pronounce it. Bein He, where the headquarters before Harbin, that was when it was based. And that was where we actually saw the train station where they used the train to transport Manchurian civilians and prisoners of war to the headquarters, and that was really the lab where they did the experiments on them. And then we had discussions about research ethics, about the unit, about Shiroishi, etc., etc. And we went, as mentioned, we went to the sites. So we went to Anda, and we go? I think that was the only site that we went to, but there are other sites all over Manchuria, actually, where this kind of experiments took place. And there are sites in other countries, like Singapore, for instance, potentially also in South Korea.
So actually adding on to that, there are sites, definitely, we have remnants of the sites, but most of these remnants are quite like indistinguishable from just like regular, garbage. We went to, what was the site with the
Zongma Fortress?
Oh yeah, there was a fortress called Zhongma Fortress, and it's now just like some sort of landfill. So it was what the locals called the killing factory. But we went there and it was just junk everywhere. So everything, all the evidence was destroyed by the Japanese when they left Manchuria at the end of World War II. So when they admitted defeat after the war ended. So it's really difficult to find evidence that this actually took place, and it only was recently sort of uncovered because the Americans released the information that they took from the Japanese researchers. So do you want to talk a bit more about like the aftermath of Unit 731?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the starkest things there is to know about Unit 71 is that after the war, almost nothing happened to the Japanese researchers, right? So during the war, or right after, as Japan was surrendering, the Allied forces started to realize that Japan had important information, valuable data that the Allied forces might use. And what happened is the United States, was the first to reach that information, to have a conversation with Shiro Ishii, have a relationship, develop a relationship with Shiro Ishii and Unit 731. And what they did was basically provide a haven to the researchers. So they hid all the information from the British, from the Russians, and from the rest of the world, and basically took all the data that the researchers had to themselves. Very few Unit 71 researchers actually were found accountable, were made accountable for their actions during World War II, during those experiments. We know that Shiro Ishii traveled to the US afterwards, and at some point he went back to Japan and continued on living his life. And there is some evidence that what the Unit 71 knew was actually used by the US in the Korea War in the 50s.
So it was mainly like germ warfare and similar atrocities. So something else is that other than the complete immunity they were granted after handing over their research, there were some doctors and researchers who were actually found guilty by the Russians at some point as well. After the war, I think maybe around 10 to 15 doctors, was it? They were also, they were actually penalized for their actions, but they weren't sentenced for as long as they really should have been, after like brutally killing so many civilians, innocent civilians, because the Russians also wanted their information. So they gave them the data and they basically got away with it to the most part. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I think the longest sentence was 7 years.
Yeah.
For some of the researchers, absolutely. And so all of them, most of them, if not all of them, got really light sentences or were not found to be accountable at all. Mm-hmm. And here we come to our day and age where researchers, even Chinese researchers, actually saying we should use that data that the Unit 71 researchers got from unconsenting civilians and prisoners of war. We should use that data nowadays. And this is the crux of our and the goal of our course and our trip, to evaluate that claim, to evaluate the ethics that is relevant to that question. Should we use that data nowadays?
Right, so that is a point of ethical consideration for us. And we also have to observe the current codes of conduct in research. Something else is, recently I read an article about how one of the ex-researchers at the Unit 731, he visited the Harbin site that we went to. He went to the museum and he was able to sort of trace back like, where the morgue used to be, or like where he used to do his experimentation. And he has expressed his regrets or remorse or something along those lines. But is that really enough? Like, there is still no sort of formal admittance of guilt and things like that. That on top of like the idea of using said research for our current investigations. So I guess that's something that we could talk about.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is also an attempt of us as medical professionals, as people who are going to be medical professionals, to come to terms with this kind of events and try to understand how it is possible that people like us, medical experiment scientists who are devoted to just benefiting their own people, benefiting patients, how can they engage in such atrocious acts, atrocious research? how they can basically torture unconsenting human beings. So that's what we are going to focus on and explore in this course.
Yeah. So stay tuned for more. Yeah, thanks for watching.